My name's Lucy Bullivant, and I'm the guest editor of the 4DSpace issue of AD, the current issue of this magazine, which I think that you can call a bookazine because it was basically about 11 months in the making. Many of you may have already seen it in the Schneidler bookshop, but essentially we decided that we would make an event to explore some of the themes and the issues in the magazine. And we've gathered together some of the contributors and the architects featured in the issue tonight. So I'm very happy to see that we have such a big audience here and such a horrible weather conditions at the moment. And so what I'm going to do is just kick off before we hold the floor open to the speakers, and just give you a little bit of a taster as to my motivations in doing this issue. It was Francis Bacon who initially said that wonder was the seed of knowledge. I have been wondering recently how the relationships between architecture and the new technologies, which are ubiquitous and ever in flux, will change over the next few years. So I decided to make 4DSpace about certain prototypes of today, and prototypes that I've found that have already established their feasibility as benchmarks of creative practice. And so 4DSpace has been born with the help of a very high-powered posse of people who have taught me a lot in the making over 10, 11 months, being the numerous architects featured and the collaborators on the writing side. And so I'm very happy to say that three of the former, Vicente Guallart, Jason Bruges and Tobi Schneidler, and three of the latter, Bouman from Arcus magazine, curator and designer, Antonino Saggio from Rome University, and thirdly, Mike Weinstock from MTech, which is short for Emerging Technologies here at the AA, are here tonight to talk about their work in this field. The other contributors being Stefano Merti and Walter April, architect and computer scientist respectively, at Ivrea, the Interactive Institute outside Milan in Italy. And we have, let's say, quite an array of talent and intelligence. So what role is 4DSpace trying to play? It's the first publication of its kind to look at a number of practitioners in the field of interactive architecture. They're responsible for a new breed of responsive environments, resulting from advanced teamwork, and that have been largely realized for a range of sectors, ranging from the workplace to the home to cultural institutions, leisure environments, borrowing strategies from one another on many levels. Whether you like it or not, those sectors are in fact borrowing from each other on many levels, not just at the architectural and design level. So I wanted to capture the sensibility of prototypical dynamism that currently exists, not purely web or computer-based activities, but ones that forge new relationships between the physical and the virtual, between nature and culture, between architects, the social and the formal. So why call it 4DSpace? Because it investigates the reality that the perceptual boundaries between the virtual and the physical have been broken in such a way that now one of architecture's tasks is to creatively adopt a fourth dimension, and that of the time-based digital technologies. So to put this in context, we have a prevalence of the digital in many of our lives, a condition approaching in some fields like retail, for instance, that is often called pervasive or ubiquitous computing. New information and communication technologies have altered society and altered architecture inexorably. The question is, how can they be harnessed through this practice of interactive architecture in a way that counteracts the continuous process of the loss of urban identity that we commonly experience? There is something about the activation of new personalized and interactive social techniques of knowledge and behaviors that builds a narrative of self and other. And now this is a very profound area that I have only just started to look into, so I won't say any more about that. But the question is, in what ways, therefore, can virtual information and communication systems and physical urban spaces interpenetrate to assist this process? And this question we hope some of the speakers will answer. So the message of the issue is also that architects are extending their professional boundaries to design and make interactive spaces in a process of teamwork with other specialists across a whole range of disciplines. And their realized works are stimulating opportunities in a cultural and social context that already sees space differently. The point being that the constant proliferation of new technologies is driving products and services that are defined in terms of user value by what their interfaces can do and the very versatility of that connectivity. That buzzword, which is the buzzword of the marketeers of all kinds of electronic gizmos, it makes me mad, mostly because I don't manage to take my computer with a drink to a beach or a desert island to work. But on the other hand, it is helpful because it evokes translocational activities, the notion of bringing distant sites together, which is an aspect of Tobi Schneidler's work, and one issue that we will explore. So there have been a few trigger points for 4DSpace. Way back as an art history student, I was motivated to look at the means of cultural production. I was one of the first students in the country to take a course called the Social History of Art. And so I was studying with young gun art historians like T.J. Clarke and John Tack. And they've long since become part of American academia. And they were great and very driving forces, very much driving forces, and they gave, I'm sure, artists playing music and bands much higher marks, which is quite amusing, that kind of thing. And I first began investigating the environmental application of new technologies and design in 1994. I was sitting drinking coffee with the German architect Christian Müller in his Frankfurt studio at the beginning of an interview with him. And he had a few years before, he'd left conventional architectural practice, his day job with Günter Benisch, to base himself at the Institute of New Media in Karlsruhe. There he found the groundbreaking conceptual artist Peter Weibel, who in his time had used every single low-tech trick in the book to make art, and was rapidly developing the place as a centre of media art. So Müller, what he did was he basically emulated the Institute's technological firepower and structures by setting up precisely the same facilities in his own office, making him the first architect ever to have set up his own electronic media studio within such a setup. Maybe somebody in the audience will know that he wasn't the first, but so now what was he going to do? There was no going back. And yet the clients came, they came from the art world, they came from other fields of commerce across the globe. So when I saw him, he was in a really bad mood, and we both kept drinking furiously more and more coffee, until I started looking at a project that he had, which he was most proud of, which was a light work on the facade of the Saal Gallery in Frankfurt, a big shopping centre. And it was beautiful, and it emitted ever fluctuating patterns of blue and yellow. And the idea was that it programmed it to change colour in relation to changing weather conditions, and it was controlled by a computer fed with data from a weather station at the top of the building. And so at dusk, the blue-yellow floating sort of phantasms appeared on the perforated steel metal surface. And what it was doing was visualizing weather changes in temperature, humidity, something that otherwise can only be felt by the skin. And then above it, the 3 by 16 meter LED display also visualized the degree of sound and the forms of sounds made by passers-by. And for me, it was a very a sublime hybrid work, art and architecture together, and a meteorological metaphor made with customized, not standard technology. And I only learned later that the reason that Moller was so ratty with me on that day was that the developer of the scheme had gone bust, meaning that its life was now doomed. So it was then that I began my search for across the world for projects that achieve that level of experiential beauty. Things that harness light, temperature, external data of all kinds, responsive and temporally nuanced, in that at any moment their identity was unpredetermined. And another trigger point for the issue has been my fascination with the way museums have now got to the point where they've adopted interactivity, and this has really changed the way they treat space. And it seems that in some quarters, the work is becoming both very intelligent and interactive and intuitive, and losing its former clunkiness. One example quickly being the new Churchill Museum in Whitehall in London, the first museum ever dedicated to a politician, where the curators attempt to present a very rounded picture of this major 20th century figure, faults and all. And you can find all kinds of things, like interactive multinodal virtual tours of his home, a vast virtual archive system housed in an interactive timeline table, like a military planning table. And it can be touched in certain places, releasing moving contextual animations that up to 25 people can use at any one time. And they say that it's probably the largest in the world. So, and walking around, you suddenly find yourself inside these sonic spaces, a place that's full of PIRs, or passive infrared sensors. Seems to me that along with the let's say the future conversion of Battersea Power Station into an interactive visitor attraction, and then we'll start working with the interactive designers, formerly did it, now all of us, on the Place, which is in West Bromwich, I think, is basically proof that this whole sector is in very good health. Giving graduates from places like MIT and so on in architecture, multimedia, robotics, a recognizable industry for future work. So, because I know and I sense that the global sector of museums seems to be in good health, I particularly wanted to examine the relationship between experimental practice and the real world sectors, where things are coming into being, where it's not yet clear what is going on, where there is still a lot of scope for, as there is in museums, for prototypes, but there's also a lot of scope to really lay down new procedures. So my focus in the issue is also with the work of architects Christian Muller, Ron Arad, Tobi Schneidler, Usman Haque, who teaches at the Bartlett, Adam Fisher, Etalab, working to self-briefs or for competitions, but along with commercial projects like by people like Jason Bruges or Klein Dytham, who have their bathhouse show here at the moment, evolved outside the established museum industry, outside the already known world of the visitor attraction. I mean, what a lot of people who are looking at this field want to know, of course, is, well, how do you really describe what you do? And how do you get work? And how obviously, and people like me want to know, how does that work impact upon perceptions of what is feasible? And I think that that's making the connection between research, being involved in a teaching institution, research, experimental projects, and real-world projects that might themselves break ground and break a new mold, create a new mold of practice. So the focus is on, in the issue, in looking at installations and events for various contexts, from the home to the urban environment. So you have the potential of an electronic skin of a building, such as the Kunsthaus in Graz by Peter Cook and Colin Fournier, working with with Realities United, the Berlin architects. In other cases, prototypes of typologies that advance the type as never before, like the Media House, which is a project for an intelligent house, evolved by a 100-strong team led by the Interactive Institute for Advanced Architecture in Barcelona, working with Neil Gershenfeld of the MIT Media Lab in the States. Now Vicente is going to join us. He's coming from Stansted. He will be here. And so he will speak, and Vicente, of course, being the director of the Institute in Barcelona, he will speak just before we have the audience questions. So architects have always been ahead of the game in their ability to evolve prototypes, hybridizing construction and technology of one sort or another. But in the media, we have limited awareness, because they're so driven by trends, of what is actually very good. And one of my beefs is that what is valued, of course, is overlooked. So I thought that it was very important to create a gestalt of an emerging field, as somebody coming from outside with a view on the overall production, and provide some conceptual frames, organizing a little bit the fragmented experiences of practitioners. Because it seems there's been a long process of architecture appropriating the skills of media artists, while interactive designers are working increasingly in environmental contexts. So I think that we do need to ask, what is interactive architecture? Because there are also reactive systems which are preconceived, and things just go through a loop. I mean, if you do a Google search on the web, you'll find, apart from this issue, of course, you'll find companies designing digital contents for games and educational tools for the web, multimedia and TV and DVD and so on. And they call their software skills interactive architecture. But of course, that's not the only definition. I mean, looking back over previous history, I mean, the predominant examples come from media art, or they are, in fact, very banal. Like, I remember the fuss made some years ago about Bill Gates's apartment in a bunker in Seattle, with the screen walls that showed a variety of paintings at a touch of a button. So it renders both art and technology like a clever form of wallpaper that you can just change instantly to change your mood. And the Italians, people like Ezio Manzini, wrote an awful lot about domotecnica, as they called it, or it was characterized. Technical ways of facilitating living in a home. But it's interesting that I think that all that theory has been long since picked up and appropriated, capitalized on by the home media security firms. I mean, thinking of security, you have, on one side, you have few architects and designers like Diller and Scofidio and Raphael Lozana Hemmer, looking at this whole field in a very critical cultural way. On the other side, you have Arabs, the engineers, who have an intelligent building department. They spend a lot of time designing security systems, as well as advancing the cause of ecologically intelligent, self-cleaning, for instance, buildings, or even buildings that might breathe in the hands of architects like Ken Yang. But I think that an awful lot of their work is designing security systems. So what we know that interactive architecture is that it is time-dependent and environmentally responsive, that space becomes personalized and customized. It's certainly not panoptic like much architecture. It's hybrid and immersive, and it draws on art practice, theories of perception, physics, biology, anthropology, cybernetics, and it takes a very imaginative spatial approach to the HCI, or the human-computer interface. Spaces might have what you call ambient or embedded intelligence. So although there are many strands in the emerging field of interactive architecture, as many as there are sources that they draw from, in general, the visitor or the user becomes the pivot. He or she is the active part of the architecture, and which is then set in motion by the viewer when detected by sensors. So as we know from movements in art in the last 50 years, they've challenged the distinction between the audience and the performer. Architects are now also beginning to pick up these new ways of seeing. And dance choreographers and architects working in tandem, like Carol Brown and Mette Ramsgaard-Thompson, who's doing a PhD at the Bartlett, they're now creating spaces which take a form of, the spaces themselves take a form of a co-presence with the dancers. So with an interactive space, the viewer stroke user sees the work but is also seen by the work. Now this tangibility is quite unsettling because the tangibility becomes the visible, the visible becomes the audible, and the acoustic the visible. So all of this makes the medium's identity unfixed and thus open to play, and that's where it gets really exciting. Both the stability and the irreversibility of typical architecture is called into play as a consequence. Now, and also fundamentally the making of interactive architecture is bottom up rather than top down, like much of the best architectural strategies today, arguably. And it's also partly because the client base and hence the procedures involved, they're scarcely identifiable in any homogeneous way. And commission works tend to be artworks or museum or gallery interfaces. So a whole world of experimentation is forming that goes beyond all of these more widely known scenarios. And the people featured in my issue have been busy using technologies of sensing, computation and display in a discrete and effective way. Or alternatively, like Realities United, or Ron Arad, using very low-tech elements, because you get more effects over more square meters for your money than if you use the high-tech equivalent of, in the case of Realities United, fluorescent 40-watt light ring tubes in a customized way. And anyone looking, I would imagine that most of you have seen the Kunsthaus in Graz, so I think that the concept of these very simple, very cheap light ring tubes is quite, let's say, attractive and also very cheap by the meter. But there is a piece in the issue that you can have a look at if you wanted to know the inside story. Another example, quickly, before we conclude, is Usman Haque, who is teaching at the Bartlett, also featured in the issue. I mean, he uses walkie-talkies to set up a simple wireless system. And he says that architects and designers don't necessarily need the precision and accuracy that, say, scientists do in order to explore the poetries of interaction. Anyway, either route, high-tech, low-tech, or middle-tech, or three routes, interactive architectural projects that are realized may well age rapidly, so that everything can be viewed as an iteration with a limited life, but no less the valuable. The technologies used are mostly in a state of rapid flux, and while they and their materials might be largely predictable, what changes are the standards in the applied technologies and the identity of the interfaces designed. And that's where architects have to be on the front line. So it was incredibly, I think, there was Stefano Merti, the architect, and Walter April, computer scientist at the Ivrea Institute in outside Milan, who they have quite a mixture, but I think probably the students are all interactive designers rather than architects. But Stefano, being their tutor and being an architect, I think he could see that the work that they're doing, which is documented in the issue, it's actually closer to product design than to traditional architecture. So one very interesting question is, what effect will that have on the future of architecture and the identity of architecture if we are, let's say, aligning ourselves with product design rather than traditional architecture? And I would say that what we hitherto have regarded as being a very kind of more mainstream identity of product design, with the, let's say, the fusion or the interconnection with architects, is going to transform it radically. So I think that the bottom line is to view everything as a prototype And that has to be the way to make creative headway in the field of interactive architecture. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Ole Bouman, who's the editor-in-chief of Arcus magazine, and also operates as a curator and a designer and an author in the field. And he will be the first of 5 speakers, and we will then finish with a platform discussion and questions from the audience. So thank you, Ole.
More? Okay. So I'm very happy to be here once again behind this lectern at the AA, especially at this particular moment in time of the history of this school, where things are going to be decided about the destiny of architecture and architects as defined by one of the leading schools in the world, being right in the middle of the dilemma between the definition of an architect as ultimately a reliable, accountable, and certifiable person, or on the other hand, an architect who might be a visionary, an intellectual, a thinker, an inventor, an artist. So if this is the dilemma, and if this is the choice that we are right in, and not just here in London and at the AA, but at many schools, and actually also many other institutions dealing with architecture, it's always nice to be in the heat of the kitchen. I think the topic of tonight, interactive architecture or 4D space, is indeed already a kind of test ground of this very definition of architecture in the future. But I can immediately say that I won't deal with it specifically. I decided to focus on 3D time. Not 4D space, but 3D time. And it's up to you to decide whether this is completely off topic or is exactly the extension of the subject that might justify the gathering here, because most have been said already in this issue. So about 4D space, I think I definitely should recommend to all of you to read it, because you will be completely updated to the present state of affairs in 4D space. And that's why I decided to continue a little bit, to expand a little bit to 3D time and see whether this have anything to do with 4D space. What I have in mind is to show you something which is indeed very bottom-up, which is indeed very low-key, and which is beyond, let's say, the very electronically based architectural environments that we most of the time consider as being 4D architecture. What I would like to present is a kind of unplugged, interactive architecture. That's a kind of wirelessness that sometimes seems to be forgotten, but is very urgent to be revived. Well, if this issue of AD is about the ongoing shift from topography to scenography in architecture, from place to time-based environments, I could say something about one of the projects that I present in this issue, which is the project Transports, which I already once in this room presented, so I won't do that again. But it's more or less a kind of summary of the whole issue. Transports was an interactive environment designed by Cas Oosterhuis and me, which could be considered as a kind of manifesto about the future of architecture dealing with these kind of time-based technologies. Why was it a kind of manifesto? Because it tried to combine several angles, several dimensions of this new emerging practice. First of all, it was animated space, animated environments through the by means of projection technologies. It was interactive by means of using sensor technologies, and it was also an effort to fuse digital or cyberspace and network space with physical and analog space, through all kinds of new interfaces that might be the new mandate for architectural design, to design interfaces rather than just the delineated spaces. I said something about that history of liquidification of architecture which led to that project in my piece in this issue, which I will quote briefly. Focusing on this notion of liquidification. For a long time, architecture was thought of as a solid reality and entity. Buildings, objects, matter, place, and a set of geometric relationships. But recently, architects have begun to understand their products as liquid, animating their bodies, hypersurfacing their walls, crossbreeding different locations, experimenting with new geometries. And this is only the beginning. We will see more and more architects realizing spatialized moments through staging narratives, through event designing, working with effects and emotions. Of course, there will be a practice of making sheds still. But to use the famous dichotomy of Robert Venturi, the decoration will not be the facade any longer. Things will be communicated, but not to glorify any past, nor to embrace any future. Things will be told in flashes, by flashes and through flashes. Architecture will still be about highlighting, but this time it is to get people high, to get them light. This is a kind of short description of this tendency of architecture towards liquidification that betrays a certain ambition of architecture to go beyond itself. But there is a problem. There is a problem because if you think of it, maybe even if architecture becomes a matter of movable situations, updatable and adjustable situations, if it becomes a kind of fused space, if it becomes a kind of linkage to all kinds of other experimental and experiential realms, it still deals with a lot of modalities that good old architecture was always based on. I'm talking about things like form. Although a shape can become a flexible and movable thing, it is still form. It still deals with technology. It's still heavily based on building industry. But moreover, it is still very much based on notions like project. We need projects. Otherwise, we cannot think of architecture. We need this concept of a project before we start thinking. We also need to think about budgets before we can start with architecture. We also need to think about clients before we can start to think about architecture. And we still deal with matter to even reach a level deeper than the ones before. So that was my problem. If you can bring up a manifesto that is more or less a summary of all kinds of tendencies towards liquidification, you still have to deal with these good old notions by which architecture from immemorial times has based itself on. Maybe I quote one more short passage which is about this dilemma to get beyond even that, even these notions. Architecture might even become more unstable than these liquid environments that we always talk about, especially by the usual suspects that are traveling around the world and are represented and displayed at so many occasions and exhibitions. Maybe you can even think about architecture like something like a gas, beyond liquid, which is already to quite an extent beyond architecture as it used to be. Beyond liquid, maybe we can go into the realm of gas. If human behavior and interaction is no longer framed by place, but is a matter of making strategic decisions and experiencing moments at remote and asynchronically related sites, and if this very remoteness and asynchronic character of our lives can be designed as an interface, then architecture will lose its character as a consistent an integrated form of cultural communication. So what would that mean if it really comes to thinking about new initiatives, thinking about new creative moments? I would like to suggest to go back to one of the core businesses of architecture throughout the millennia, establishing social relations, not just by spatializing them, but by temporalizing them. If you do that, I think you come up with something like unsolicited architecture. That might be the concept to get beyond these modalities and categories like client, budget, site, technology, form, as I mentioned before. Unsolicited architecture, would that be possible? Like advice that has been requested, or advice that is given by architecture unsolicitedly. I would like to show you a couple of impressions of what that could mean as far as the medium that I'm running, Archis Magazine, is concerned. I would like to show you a few of the samples taken from the RSVP events that we organized last year, which by itself were about organizing dialogue, but also about intervening in certain spatial and temporal relations. This is the moment where you might start to think this is completely off topic. We have been going to several places throughout the world where we try to organize an intense dialogue, an intense discourse on certain essential problems of architecture today. And we have used the place, the site where the discussion took place, as one of the actors of the debate. I suggest you to read this. Can you read it? Maybe I just speak up loudly. Just as architecture is full of concepts that are in danger of sinking under their own weight, so the debate about architecture is organized according to worn-out formulas. The conference, the lecture, the seminar, the workshop. Architecture seems to have been reduced to the mantra of academic exchange, far removed from realities in which architecture is not only a topic of discussion, but also a source of conflict. Archis is therefore introducing a new form of debate, events in which reflection and action coincide, in which spirit becomes architecture with you as its bricks and mortar. There we have the social element. So I won't explain all of the images because this is a larger presentation than just to be squeezed in 10 minutes. But these are some categories that could be equaled to the social act that was happening there. Tajiks in a train between Vilnius and Moscow. This is the basic idea. To create, by means of these events, not just podiums for debate, but to create a certain engine for ideas that might in itself become a network of intellect. So based on these events, based on these discussions, we try to create a kind of travelogue, a travel guide, so to speak, that was not just about places, but about ideas that might emerge from these places. So, for instance, one of these ideas is how to deal with the weight of history. And where else than in the city of Athens can you deal with the problem of history that's becoming too heavy? where a city becomes a forensic space, a place that is full of scars and traces of a history that can no longer be overcome, where gated communities are not around rich people trying to defend their money, but around completely emptied places within the city where just historical treasures are preserved, like here. And then always this monument of civilization hovering over the city. So we try to find in that city places where, in a clandestine way, people were able to dig a hole, use the ground again, trying to move around this weight of history, or comment on official decisions to dig into the holy ground of Athens. As I said, I won't explain everything, but we were traveling from Athens to Pergamon on the other side of the Aegean Sea, where we found a place which was once an extremely important historical place, Pergamum, but was, let's say, 140 years ago, completely sacked by the Germans, taking out all the historical monuments and transporting them to Berlin, and this is what was left. So at the end of that trip from Athens to Pergamum, we ended up in Istanbul, where we did a performance with some co-travelers, artists from Greece, who threw historical motifs into the Golden Horn. So if you do that, if you not just take the historical physicality, but the historical metaphor, the classical form, with you by means of polystyrene, and you throw it in the Golden Horn, you get an awful lot of comments from the Turkish people who either think you completely lost your mind by wasting his civilization by throwing it in the water, or showing a kind of relief about the relativation of historical form. So these moments of interactivity, these moments of encounter are important. Or these, where little boys were just playing with the historical artifacts and trying to save them. And this was another idea that came up from a trip to the Middle East, where we decided to bring back some of the Holy Land to the point of origin where it all started, the Mount Nebo, the place where Moses overlooked the Promised Land and said that it was meant for the Jews, for the chosen people. And of course, as we all know, this gaze of Moses from Mount Nebo is still the core of the dispute that goes on today. I skipped a film about the gaze of Mount Nebo, but you have to think about the performance on that Mount Nebo, which is, let's say, symbolically so incredibly important to a spatial debate which resonates around the world for millennia. So I jump to the next idea in the empire of ideas. How public space, formerly known as public space, is now used for all kinds of new uses. For instance, by making it more official, like this square in Athens, the Omonia Square, which happens to be the most expensive piece of urban design in the history of Greece. and you see the results. Some lighting schemes on the facades bordering the square. Or the tourist space of the Red Square, which for decades was mostly known across the world as the place where the Red Army was holding its yearly parade. So we organized discussions about what is official of official public space. How is officiality produced? And we did research at many places throughout the world to see how public space was used. Or we organized conferences by using headphones at places where you are not supposed to hold conferences. So by infrared system you could have fierce debates without the people owning that place even knowing it. So trying to set up events that are going beyond the regular exchange of arguments and trying to test the limits of the spatial regime at the place, which is of course at this place a very explicit case. Or doing conferences in trains, traveling from different cities within the EU to cities that are still out the EU. Going to the Statue of Liberty and finding out that it's the place where there is the heaviest security check that I ever encountered. Going through sniffer machines, finding all your dust, detecting all your dust particles and subjecting them to incredibly research, examination. So what I'm talking about is to inject a kind of performative dimension in dialogue, using not just the symbolism, the symbolic order of a place, but also the tenseness of this place as actor, as contributor to the discussion. So we organized a debate in Amman, Jordan, where people from Beirut came to tell us how Beirut is in a permanent state of besiegedness. And this guy showing his research, this is the other guy, the research of an assassination in the public square in Lebanon in 1975, which is very close, which we didn't know that yet, very close to the place where Hariri was recently assassinated, again by unknown perpetrators, just as here, unknown perpetrators using public space to do, like say, a decisive act of history without authorship. These two, decades later, found on this photograph. And this was the medical report that they showed at that meeting in Amman that they found, which was never published, but what was explicit in its mentioning about the angle of the bullets as they entered the bodies of the dead man. And then maybe as a final example of trying to find places where performativity, intervention, and dialogue coincide, the checkpoints between Jerusalem and Ramallah. Losing time and use time. This is a very, let's say, very clear example of jumping from the 4D space discussion to the 3D time discussion. The explicit aim was here to find out whether this loss of time, which is to which a whole people is subjected every day, Palestinians losing 5 hours a day on the average just by waiting, and Israeli soldiers losing 2 years of their lifetime by just checking, how these two peoples were losing time and could start to use that time in a more constructive way. There should be a short film here, but as always, if you put a film in PowerPoint, then you are in trouble. Well, let me just explain. The question was, could we use architectural and design intelligence to an issue like losing time? We invited the Palestinians and Israeli alike to think about this loss of time and to use that time for different purposes in the future, like nation building, like creating personal relationships, by talking to each other, by selling stuff. Use the time that is lost for powerful, constructive purposes. So we did a workshop in Ramallah asking people to think about that, and I think I consider that as unsolicited architecture. You may play a role where people or clients don't even think of architecture as the main contributor to the discussion. Well, this is another example of research about design and ideology, and it's pretty topical if you see where if you see the name of the city, which was the background of the summit between Bush and Putin today. I will skip this. former Iron Curtain. What we did is traveling around the new borderlines of EU and doing a kind of taxonomy and examination of the way we deal with borders, not just on a national level or the level of new economic blocks and the rest of the world, but also on a much more micro level, trying to find out how people deal with borders anyway. I have no time to show you carefully all these examples, but I just want to emphasize the approach itself, the strategy itself, to go beyond form, site, technology, project, budget, client, material, to come to a real unsolicited architecture. This might imply new forms of activity for architects, where dialogue and debate and reflection coincide with architectural intervention, spatial intelligence, and performance, converging the reflection about architecture and architectural practice today. And I believe that going beyond architecture in terms of new media, in terms of ambient atmosphere, in terms of borrowing technologies, insights, inspiration from media theory, from technology, from art, etc., is an incredible important step for architecture to take on, to reinvent itself, to find a new mandate, and to go beyond itself. But it might equally be a trap, as at least it should be, let's say, it should be sustained by another, more low-key, simple act of transcending architecture into the field of social action and using spatial intelligence at places where people never thought about architecture as the main protagonist to help them out their problems. What we try to do the next couple of months, maybe years, I don't know, is to continue that research. From Monday onwards, we will change Arcis into a new magazine. Will be launched next Monday at Columbia University in New York. It will be titled Volume. It will be a teamwork between countless members of a network, but to begin with AMO, Columbia University Architecture School, and Arcis, and trying to put together this energy into something more than just a bunch of paper. A magazine is important, an important medium. It is paperwork. It may represent what's going on outside, but it can never be the action itself. So what we would like to do pretty soon is to present a box. I'll show you here in a drawing, or it is one. A box in which things can happen. A radical move beyond magazine making. So just as I made a kind of commercial in the last couple of minutes about architecture going beyond itself and the need to do so, I also talked to myself, actually, honestly, to get magazine making going beyond itself, going beyond the paperwork, the representational, the stiffness and passiveness of relating to things that happen outside and coming after that by reacting, by commenting, by criticizing, and creating a space within magazine making that in itself might become the field of action. So by organizing events and by creating an action space as the magazine itself, we hope that we can continue elaborating that very idea of combining reflection, dialogue, and architectural intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. I think that was. Thank you, Roland. I think that was testimony to artists' indefatigable research into the real world, and in terms of ethos and activity. I don't think anyone could accuse artists of not being very much on the front line in terms of its activities. So next up we have Tobi Schneidler, who is an alumni of the AA, and he is based in Stockholm, German interactive architect, who has been based in Stockholm and for some time has been working on projects in a smart studio at the Interactive Institute there. He has now, in the last few months, launched his own practice and is still connected with a smart studio. And you may connect him to a very interesting project that was recently at the Science Museum called the Remote Home. He's going to talk very briefly about that and some other brand new projects. Thank you, Tobi.
Great. Just going to move this over here. Yeah, hi everyone. As Lucy said, I'm actually here as a kind of a split personality in very practical terms that I'm set up my own stuff now, my own company, and doing projects in private practice, as you would call it, with people like MVRDV. But I'm also still also associated to the Interactive Institute in Stockholm. I'll just briefly talk about that. It's actually a media lab in the classic sense that it was set up with the intention of bringing artists, architects, designers, and technologists together to create new kinds of applications. Of course, it was kind of a product of the whole technology bubble, all these kind of fantasies that people had a few years ago about what technology could do for societies, etc. So that's the practical aspects of my split personality. Now comes some deeper issues that actually, when I was released from this institution about 5 years ago, I left with this kind of fantasy like you do as an architect. You don't do stuff for real. You get your diploma on some paperwork or maybe some models. But I left with this kind of hunch that technology could actually change something more fundamental within architecture, within architectural production and the creation of space, than just using it for the creation of representational models, renderings, etc. So since then I've actually been hanging out a lot with people in fields that most architects actually would never dare to get close to, even have heard about it, in fields such as computer-human interaction, what Lewis has been looking into in the issue, ubiquitous computing applications. There's this whole huge communities around these issues, how computers become embedded invisibly in environments, the issues of tangible media, how media and digital technologies influence our physical environments. To each of these kind of headlines, and there's a certain lingo within all these areas, there's a huge discourse going on. I've been exposed to a lot of that, and in the course of that I've been creating a number of projects that actually I've been since then mapping within a kind of a matrix of scale and resolution. The thing that I'm quite interested in is, I don't ask myself if I'm an architect or not, but definitely all of the things that I've been doing have an architectural intention. So I actually want to quickly show you now 3 projects that have these architectural intentions, and which actually have been created in real space, in the real meat world, as people involved in virtual realities are saying. So my key interest behind all of the work is what effect digital technologies can actually have on our physical world, on the physical extents of space, and what are the real things that can actually be changed within the use and the program of it. So my projects are actually positioned within these three different scales: the architectural scale, literally the kind of spaces that surround us, building scale; personal scale, which is much more, of course, a topic in interaction design and in industrial design, but also translocational space, which is a thing that can only be achieved with technologies at hand, communication technologies, etc. I also include maybe more urban projects within this category. And of course, people have been talking since the Bauhaus about a range of scales that architectural projects can touch. And that's kind of an issue that also I'm very interested in and pursuing in projects I'm doing. So, first of the three projects, which has been widely discussed, is the remote home. And essentially, this is a almost autobiographical project. On this matrix, I actually position it between the architectural and the translocational scale. It is, in effect, a very sort of defined space of an apartment, but it also extends over distance. And explain how this actually works right here. The project actually started as an almost autobiographical kind of reflection. I was at that time working in two different places, actually in Stockholm and in London. Plus, at that time, I was also in a long-distance relationship, which incidentally took place in Paris. And on top of that, I'm German, so I have a lot of stuff to do in Germany. So, again, more split personality stuff, more confusion. But I thought, what does it actually mean to create a home, a place of belonging in an architectural setting that actually doesn't exist just in one city, but actually in two? And how do you design for these kind of conditions? So within the physical extents of this environment, I replicated certain features that would actually reappear on the matching site, like responsive walls that would actually measure occupation and movement within the space and then replicate it through the internet onto the other side. But also things like furniture that you can actually remotely occupy, or more ambient light installations which would be transmitting their effects through a data connection to the other side and then physically reappear. And all this is happening with state-of-the-art infrastructure like this broadband connection in front of my door in London. So it's very household stuff. I mean, it's not really high-tech, it's not rocket science. There's some pictures which also appeared within the issue, a light installation which basically transmits a kind of a sandbed activity that people quite intuitively engage in, and translates that into a light interpretation on the other side. And also a bench, a furniture that's actually embedded within a social function. It's about taking out conflicts in an environment. When you share a place, when you share it with flatmates, with family, etc., there's disputes over who's allowed to use the kitchen table, who can sit down for the telly, etc. And I wanted to play this out in real space with a quite innocently looking object, which then actually takes on its own life. So, just going to show you some footage from a German TV presentation that actually recently happened. This is my sister, and we actually set up the remote home in London and Berlin to demonstrate these kind of issues. So here you actually see how physical it can be. Sorry about the German. So, in this project is quite typical in the sense that technology isn't visible as such. It's actually embedded, and the design adapts, and there's a story behind the design that actually conditions the use of the space. So, switch that off here. Some silly interview. But it's also like things like issues that deal more with the ambience of the space, like these lamps that actually trigger on the occupation again of the space, that follow the imaginary occupant on the other side. And this is transmitted as data through the internet and then reappears again in the connected home, in the other side of the remote home. There are also mobile features like this bag, which is actually controlled through a remote radio connection, which also reacts to occupation within the space. Of course, this kind of, project is very much embedded in a technology discourse called telepresence and so on. But there's also the most important issue behind this project, and I think why people have been so interested in it is because there's actually a social dimension behind it. It's not for technology's sake that we've done this. There's actually another kind of use which goes beyond the kind of utility of it. Another project which kind of deals with the with the notion of scale, much more as a response to how architects traditionally have been working, is Responsive Fields, which is an installation that we've opened last year at ZKM, a new media place that Lucy was talking about as well in Germany. It was part of an exhibition, or still is, called Algorithmic Revolutions, which actually featured a lot of architects and designers. It's actually a retrospective of interactive art and design over a course of, I think, 50 years almost. And in the Responsive Fields, I actually wanted to explore together with Pablo Miranda, who is another architect who's very interested in algorithmic systems and autonomous systems. We wanted to explore how you could actually model issues of interactivity in a scaled environment, in a scaled space. In architecture, of course, there's a great tradition of building models and having these models, viewing these models in a kind of a top-down, godlike perspective, and then anticipating what that would be like in reality. And there's a whole training that goes on, how you do that for yourself as part of the process, but also how you actually use this as a tool to communicate to the client. But in this case, we wanted to try how you could actually use it much more also as a modeling of the interactivity in real space, but at a scaled size. So it is a simple, small installation that was incidentally positioned right next to all sorts of examples of blob architecture, which didn't do much except for hanging on the wall. And it suggested a certain kind of use by its design. So that's also an important thing in interaction design. How do you actually make an object or an environment communicate its intended use or its intended interaction? So in this case, we actually set up a kind of confined space where you could which you could occupy with your hands. This would be registered by 5 ultrasonic sensors, which would then be mapped onto the surface of a monitor, which was kind of the floor space. And you would then be able to interact with about 5,000 little red agents, which in a lagged process would draw traces and recreate an ever-changing ephemeral space. So you didn't have any direct interaction with it, but a lapsed interaction and something which you were part of, but where you were more or less interacting with an autonomous system as well. And this is a great challenge if you actually deal with these issues of interactivity, because in a lot of times the technology in itself is pretty useless. The technology in itself doesn't tell you much about what it may be good for, just as a computer could be used for anything. But when you actually reach a moment where people meet a piece or meet an installation, meet a work, and they intuitively know how to engage or have a feeling how to engage with it, then it feels very successful. In this case, very happy that that people intuitively found their way into it and actually got interested in participating within this small model space. And the last project is a very short time-based lecture, so I'm going to keep it compact. It's actually a collaboration with my sister, who happens to be a fashion designer. I was just setting up her business in Berlin. That's her. And she's actually very interested in creating also kind of time-based, again, a kind of a collection that actually develops over time. She doesn't follow the usual fashion model of being like having 2 collections per year, but she's actually designing piece by piece, and she's actually triggered on news and on world events, which she picks up in newspapers and on the internet. And every time she comes across something interesting, she actually creates this piece, and every piece is receiving a label that instead of the brand actually has a date stitched into its back. And every piece therefore stands for a certain point in time which relates to a certain world event. So she created pieces like this jumper, which basically has all the names written out in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, big German daily newspaper. So it's stitched by electronic, knitting machines into this jumper. And we were actually thinking about how you could create a kind of a tool for her studio, a kind of an installation that could make this absorption of information more intuitive or fun, that could support her process within the studio. Much like you have these weird things called neutrinos, like zooming through the planet, and nobody knows what they are, and it's this mystery particle that can go straight through Mother Earth, but you can actually catch it in some huge water containers and make them visible and show the traces. And essentially that's what we wanted to do for this project too, to actually place this kind of furniture, this installation within her studio, within this kind of datascape, within this Hertzian space as Tony Dunn's defined it, and pick up information but make it actually visible in a very physical sense. So rather than using sophisticated LCD projectors with ultra high resolution, we actually do quite an electromechanical way of dealing with information here. So essentially what we have here is a metal drum that's encoded physically with it's bigger, with random letters, but these random letters can actually be positioned precisely through a lens to actually manifest on a certain area to become real letters. And the installation is essentially going to have 8 of those drums, creating 8 letters. And the thing with doing projects like this is that by prototyping this, by trying it out, you actually create a lot of effects that weren't so anticipated before, like all the ambient projections that are taking place, things that you only find out through the modeling process that actually show up over time. So this is like a real view into the studio as it's happened right now. We're actually completing this project in 3 weeks. And then I can maybe come back sometime and show a more finished picture. But I thought it would be interesting anyway to share that with you. These are some pictures from the installation. The actual words and fragments of these new streams coming in will be actually projected on a semi-mirrored glass, so you can actually reflect yourself in world events as they unfold. This is Milo sitting on the prototype and the disc starting to rotate. And of course there's also a lot of digital technology involved in the creation of these kind of projects, like laser cutting and CAD programs to actually manufacture this kind of stuff. But that's really not at the essence of what I'm interested in. I'm actually quite intrigued how digital information, which is by nature very ephemeral, can actually affect on physical environments that we actually inhabit with flesh and blood. So I think this is pretty much all I have to say.
Thanks very much, Tobi. I would like to say with our next speaker, Jason Bruges, we've talked a little bit about clients in the abstract, and I don't think there are any of the people in the 4DSpace issues clients here tonight, but it was my pleasure to be taken on a double-decker bus by Jason Bruges with his client, the head of urban regeneration of Havering, together with a lot of champagne, to the marshlands of Havering along the A13, a very kind of circuitous spaghetti junction of a whole lot of roundabouts. And there I witnessed the most amazing LED light sculpture called Litmus. And I don't know if it was the champagne or what it was, but I think had I been totally sober, it still would have had an amazing effect on me. So more than that I will not say, because that's Jason's job. Jason is one of a graduate of Oxford Brookes and the Bartlett. He is really one of the few practitioners in this country that I've identified who has created a very sustainable practice full-time in a studio of 3, 4, 5 and counting people over in the east of London, offering interactive architectural services to clients, not just in this country and abroad. And I mean, I hope that what Jason's doing is a sign that increasing confidence in this field, and that he can open a way to other practitioners coming into this area. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks very much, Lucy. We've been going for 3 years now, and at last I'm in the kind of privileged position to actually show some built work. It's taken that long. And interactive architect is probably the most favourable term I use to describe the work I do. I've counted the other day, I probably described my work in probably about 16 different ways in order to sell it, from probably lighting designer, interaction designer, artist, installation architect, installation artist, and the list goes on. But certainly, hopefully, after events like this, I can start to call myself interactive architect rather than all these kind of less kind of perfect words. I'll talk through some of the philosophy and approaches of the studio. We're very interested in the built environment and the public realm and how people use it. And it's really the kind of analysis of spaces and how people use them that kind of directs how the work is formed. It's process-led, pretty much all of it's site-specific, so it's responding to a client's wish, be it commercial, or a condition, or a kind of, may even be a whim of mine, based on how a site is working. They range from being very commercial, we do consultancy, right through to art installations for galleries or for sort of regeneration projects and that type of thing. This is a kind of early proposal for BT Open World, looking at kind of circulation spaces. A lot of our projects look at how people use spaces, and this was really looking at how all the kind of circulation spaces, particularly within buildings, can be enlivened by very kind of simple mechanisms, recording memories of how people use space, leaving traces, leaving kind of layers in terms of kind of palimpsest fashion. And this, hopefully, this will kind of, you'll see this develop through the few projects I'm going to show you. Here's another piece for Dave Stewart's hospital building. Didn't get built, but we spent quite a lot of time doing research and development for a kind of vertical memory wall, which would actually capture movement of people through space. 3-story high piece, cast acrylic chainmail, self-addressed pixels, all embedded within the surface, hanging down through the space, and mapping people's movement. It had different interactive functions, sort of being asleep, like a screensaver, creating lots of electronic wakes, and then getting more interested as more people use the space. So you get kind of constructive and deconstructive interference. And for a lot of the pieces, they're not really complete without the kind of interaction. They're very much like performances, although they're within the built environment. We're doing actually some work with a theatre at the moment, but it's like, it's all to do with how people interact with it. And quite often I won't actually know how a piece is going to react or really kind of be able to visualise it until I see a space and see how people are actually using it. So quite often we go in film spaces and just analyse, perhaps not in this quite scientific way as people like space syntax at UCL do, or data mining that's done within the retail environment with cameras and sensors and that type of thing, but it's still, you know, getting a feel for a real space and how it's really used on a day-to-day basis. And then again, looking further at how people interact with spaces, this was a concept proposal for T-Mobile. How can people seed their space with their kind of ideas, and how can they interact with their architecture, their environment? This was looking at the notion of broadcasting an algorithm or a program to people's phones, which they could then use to respond to their spaces, creating kind of annotations, keyframes within their kind of experience of the space. This was the piece here was going to be an 8 by 8 metre dynamic light sculpture. But then taking the piece outside the building, this was a collaboration with Yoshida Finlay for the BBC Music Centre. It was actually looking at how the building would respond both to the inhabitants, which were the BBC Philharmonic Orchestra, and to the environment outside. So there was a kind of two-way conversation going on here. Seeing what was happening inside the private spaces of the auditoriums, making that kind of apparent and readable for the people outside. So it's a black box architecture, and then actually feeding information from the prevailing wind, the southwesterly wind, going across White City and making that apparent within the extending columns of the building. So you actually get these ephemeral light patterns hovering above the building. And also, these were going to be mirrored and recreated as soundscapes within the building as well. We looked at columns that could actually oscillate and generate a voltage. So you actually use the kind of physical properties of the building as well, not just the building as a sensor and as potentially a musical instrument. And creating patterns above the public spaces based on those interference patterns. So going from the kind of built environment to something a lot more ephemeral but equally important. This was a piece worked on with artist Anna Hill and 3D sound expert Martin Ware. She filmed the auroras in northern Finland. Her brief was to recreate an installation for the Kilkenny Arts Festival. Not only did she film the kind of visual space, but also took readings from the magnetic observatory. And we recreated a space in Kilkenny which kind of recreated a lot of the kind of feelings and the ambience and mood of that space. The Inuit believe if you sing to the auroras, you can actually change their prevalence within the sky, or the kind of the amount which they appear. So we created these wireless interfaces, so you can actually walk around this room and move the projected auroras around the space around you, depending on how you breathe or sang into this piece. And also there was a 3D soundscape that was taken from the magnetic observatory. Going back to the sort of memories and creating memories within a space, in the same way a building will age, mark and respond to its use. Transitory spaces like hotels I thought would be quite interesting. This is a project I'm working on again with Yoshida Finlay on the Puerto Americas Hotel in Madrid. As you might know, there's an architect per floor. We're above Ron Arad and below Jean Nouvel. And you come out of the sky lifts into the lobby, and the space here is basically capturing, like an electronic blotting paper, your movements, moods, the colours you're wearing, and recreating them as a sort of memory within the walls for the rest of the day. We're doing this in a sort of very painterly way. It's not meant to be a kind of, and a lot of the work we do, we kind of strip down the essence and the mood and the quality of spaces we're trying to change, rather than being very high-tech about it. It's actually a curved glass reinforced gypsum wall that actually circles right around the space. You come out of the sky lifts and there's a series of cameras basically capturing your movement, your dwell time, your position within the room, and recreating that on the walls of the space. There's a kind of bit of trickery going on, but essentially it's interpreting the kind of camera input and playing that back through a kind of very low resolution TV, which is flush, built into the architecture of the space. And essentially this is a sketch showing how it works. This is kind of the immediate effect, but the idea is you get delays and responses that are kind of more time-based, more 4D. So the longer you stay, the longer your kind of colour is used within the kind of blotting surface, as it were. And there's just a little preview. It's not, the piece hasn't been commissioned, so this is like its test screen phase, as it were. But these kind of big curved walls with kind of polka dots of kind of different colours and lights responding to you. This happens on both sides, and this kind of sort of mirror your movement as you walk through the space. And then there's two 22-metre long corridors branching off this space towards all the rooms. Not wanting to be quite so unsettling in the kind of more cosy confines going to your room, wanted to create this thing, and the concept here was really thinking about kind of flock wallpapers, and wallpapers that have a kind of thickness, and creating a texture that could actually change in response to your movement, again your dwell times. And the idea that we actually put to the client, Grupo Vasco, was actually this could actually be a wayfinding device as well, so that your room key may, the effect may stop as you arrive at your room. And I'm very interested, I mean, we get commissioned to do a lot of art installations and pieces which may only seem to have some kind of aesthetic or kind of architectural merit, but also functional devices, which may have many layers of kind of possibilities and kind of uses. Within this environment, there's lots of things going on. We've got, if you look either way along the corridor, there's 8 zones of interactivity, and we're analysing people's movement throughout that whole space. So there's ripples and waves and shadows being created within the walls in the whole 44-metre entirety of the space. But every project's different. We kind of sort of pride ourselves on really kind of looking at what's appropriate. We were retrofitting this piece to a space which is very difficult, and in Madrid, and quite hard to predict what the built condition would be. So we ended up inventing this polyurethane wallpaper which we could pipe light through. And it's kind of a curious thing. You sort of end up asking manufacturers for things you want, and you go round and round in circles, and eventually you'll find out you've designed something that doesn't exist, which was the case in this scenario. So like a wallpaper that you just stick to the wall and pipe light through, and it's kind of addressable, so you can move bands of light through it. But it had to be fireproof and all sorts of things. Working on a piece with Raphael Vanoli for the new Leicester Performing Arts Centre. The client was actually Leicester Council. They had the foresight to want some kind of interactive light piece within the facade or within the kind of public areas of this new building. His vision was for an inside-out space. People using the foyers, people using the stages within the building that could be seen from outside. Also, a key component or parameter for this is the kind of regeneration of the area, so being able to see the building and see the activity taking place in a very kind of derelict part of Leicester. So I actually started looking at how the building was used and how those activities could actually be kind of sampled and played back. This is an example of sort of sketches for stage instructions, blocking, which create different movements and moods on stage depending on how long you spend in different areas, the dwell times, where you exit, and that type of thing. So the idea would be you do this across the building, so many different areas, not only looking at the kind of theatre as a kind of whole entity, so not the prop room, the ticket office, the bar, all having their own everyday performances, and playing back these kind of notations for the movement in them on the facade of the building. So a sort of simple mapping. There's a large brise-soleil system running across a glazed facade, and basically on all the kind of edges there's a LED matrix which can play back kind of light notation. This project's featured in the book. This is an art installation for the Gloucester Royal Hospital. This idea really stemmed from what the architecture wasn't doing for the space. It's an outpatients area, people sitting around a closed courtyard, an inaccessible courtyard, for up to 2 hours. And there was really, for me, no link with the sky or with the kind of external environment of Gloucester. So I wanted to kind of recreate and bring some of the sky into the space. So this is kind of some video from Gloucester, but actually analysing that, and actually people get kind of a lot of ideas about what's happening outside based on kind of brightness and contrast matrix. So if it's bright one end of the room and not the other, you'll know what type of day it is. If it's rapidly changing, you'll know it's windy. So there's lots of things you can do with the communication of light to tell people about the environment in the building. So I've actually pulled it down into the space, hanging it off a catenary structure, so it's very lightweight and you can still get light in. Each teardrop, as it were, within the chandelier maps onto a portion of the sky. So you'll get activity responding in real time to the sky. And you might go, well, Gloucester has something like 100 days of overcast sky, so we're using a Met Office camera to analyse the cloud structures and the crystal sizes, so it still animates even under typical English weather. And there's quite. I was looking at some other different schemes for this site, and we were actually looking at kind of things like camera obscuras as well to bounce light in and bounce views in. But then it turned out that one of the spaces next to the site was the ophthalmology department, so people could only see the difference between light and dark. So that was one of the kind of driving parts of the brief that we found out about while we were actually proposing things to the client. That's how it happens. While we're on clouds, this was a piece that we did last year for the V&A, taking the notion of a kind of 16th century painted skyscape as a fresco, but doing a 21st century version of this, creating a infinity ceiling, a moving cloudscape that responded to people's movements below it. So the more people that inhabited the space, the more stormy the sky became. And also, as you moved around, that you kind of basically generated the movement of the winds and the prevailing wind conditions. So it was really interesting as well how you could make people interact with their space. And it was for Architecture Week, so it was about people responding to their architecture. So, and this project's for the London Borough of Havering. That's the last one I'm going to show. And this was an open competition to design some wayfinding devices stroke sculptural gateways on the A13 running east-west into London. The Thames you can see just to the south of the image. The landscape changes from a very industrial, neglected areas of kind of the Ford estate, going towards the marshes of Rainham, which have just been recently saved. And there's a large volume of traffic that uses this road have absolutely no awareness of the kind of surrounding environment. A lot of money is being put into that area through the European Union and the sort of Thames Gateways initiatives, and London Riverside and GLA, and really wanted to look at how we could create a sort of series of environmental barometers to actually kind of analyse this space. So it's a kind of very simple analogy to like a probe you might even stick in a plant pot to analyse what's going on right there and then. So there's a kind of language of devices and things competing for your attention along the A13. Billboards, elevated oil tanks, burning cars, piles of 20-foot containers, all sorts of things. So these things were stretched up very high. And then we used the technology that's very ubiquitous and readily used within variable message displays above motorways. So we basically cannibalised the technology from these and used the same sort of system of an alphanumeric display, but floated it fairly transparently above these roundabouts at a height where it could be kind of visible to the motorist. So these are 12 metre high structures, all linked to different environmental conditions. And the idea is that people can actually change the data feeds into them from different environments. At the moment, one's counting the traffic coming in and out of London. So there's kind of this floating, changing number above this roundabout, which is reflecting that. There's one which links to Ecotricity's wind turbine on the diesel assembly plant site. There's one which measures the tidal levels at Tilbury, and there's one taking lux levels. So these are the construction drawings, and we had to pile down to 12 metres, so they're a bit like icebergs. These were the kind of some of the animations just to sort of look at the presence, the big enough presence to be seen, but not too much to cause crashes. We're to undertake safety audit and gain planning permission, all the sort of things that usually happen for a building, but actually in a harsher, more difficult environment. And then the real thing. I mean, they may not be everyone's sort of favourite thing, but what one of the things that we're very keen to do is get feedback and find out how people are responding to the environment in a different way as a result of planting these devices there. So we're doing sort of research. We're planning to do some questionnaires with lorry drivers, taxi drivers and all sorts of people to get lots of feedback on how they're kind of viewed and seen. And the sculptures themselves. This is the one that's mapping light levels, so it goes from about 7 lux, pointing right at the sky. Hopefully in the summer it will go up to about 60,000 lux for a summer's day. This one shows, this is at low tide at Tilbury, so it goes down to about 900 millimetres. And it was interesting, we started to look at these things as being sculptures and kind of devices that kind of give you information, but we started applying language which you might find on websites, so it's like what kind of transitions should we have and things like that. So you started to apply a different way of thinking, and also the speed at which you sample information. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jason. I think maybe you could call litmus numerical architecture or meteorological architecture. Certainly one thing when I saw it in the flesh that it does very effectively is just counteract the very depressing dull effect of that ubiquitous sodium lighting along dual carriageways. And with the sky chandelier, the National Health Service should just sign up. Every national health service in every county should buy at least 100 of them for every hospital across the country. Okay, now we're going to quickly move on to Mike Weinstock, who everyone who studies and teaches here will know extremely well. Is the co-founder and co-director with Michael Hensel of the Emergent Technologies Design Masters Programme. But as we've got members of the public too, and it pays to underline some details that Mike Hensel were also editors of the last issue of AD, which is the Emergence issue, which was so popular and is so amazing that I lent it to somebody and it's never come back. But Mike is very active as a teacher and curator of exhibitions, lecturer widely on architecture, urban and technical issues. And he contributed an essay in the magazine 4DSpace on aspects of the smart, intelligent home. So he's going to talk a bit about that. Thanks, Mike.
Hello, I'm going to be really brief, and I'm not going to show any images, although there are some nice pictures in this. So if you read it, you can look at the images. When I was asked to contribute, I was quite uneasy because in some ways I find myself completely at odds with what passes for architectural work on smart homes. And in my article I put forward a series of arguments which are not so much to do with the idea of smartness in a home, but how we actually live in homes and what use these kind of new technologies could be for them. And I start by recalling that the coupling of space, domesticity and technology is part of our architectural inheritance. And far from taking that for granted, we should re-examine that. Space and time are inextricably linked in domesticity. And part of my re-examination is to look at the work of two anthropologists, Mary Douglas and Marc Auger. Mary Douglas, to be brief, argues that a home is a kind of pattern of activity in time, that nothing really has to be fixed in terms of the walls or the space or the furniture, but the regular kind of comings and goings of people who flow through it and their activities are what makes it a home. And her analysis is really useful because we live in a world where the patterns of activity, our ways of living, are not the same as our architectural inheritance. Auger has a really great thesis where he differentiates between place and non-place. And what he calls a place is somewhere where people dwell, where there's social interchange and the spoken word. And what he called a non-place were things like airport lounges and banks and so forth, where they're spaces of transit. They're assemblies of solitude. Large groups of people, but everyone alone. And there's a kind of transaction in some case going on that has a structure in time. And my argument is, to extend that thesis, that domestic space has become something like Auger's formulation of non-place. And in particular, the kind of fantasies that I've seen of smart homes revolve around an idea of real time. And I argue that real time has something very paradoxical about it, that the more we are connected to a kind of unfolding datascape, the more images and codes that we deal with, the more our phenomenal personal presence is muted. Real time is unlocated and is mute. I turn from there to looking at two works, one by Ian Forster, a novelist, and the work of Jacques Tati, Monsieur Hulot. And we should remember as architects and as technologists that most of the world doesn't agree with us. Most people either find, like Monsieur Hulot, interacting with technology humorous, or, like Ian Forster, who wrote almost 100 years ago a very powerful short story called When the Machine Stops, they find it alarming. 100 years ago, he wrote about a world in which everybody lived in an individual underground cell, where they only communicated to other people in the exterior world through what he called a kind of electric or optic plate. And his plea was only connect. And the protagonist in the story eventually escapes to the surface. He has a kind of terrible confrontation between the difference between his mediated perceptions and his phenomenal perceptions. In the rest of the article, I look at the possibilities of re-engaging our architectural inheritance for spatial differentiation. A small look at the round plan of Luce, connectivity, continuous connectivity of Mies, the moving and flexibility from the Ripbelt Schroeder house, small things that can make big spatial changes. And I also look at what I claim myself to be the origin of modernist ideas of the architecture of domesticity, which is Japanese house, which again is differentiated by section. The article looks briefly at the available technologies, which in my view are all present and all we are fully capable of making a spatially differentiated and phenomenally marked architecture that is fully interactive. And that's looking at Knock's work on the saltwater pavilion particularly, at some of the work of Decoy on movable surfaces, at the computational models of what makes that possible. I don't really look at the mechanics. The mechanics in my mind were solved very interestingly in 1930 in a very beautiful house, El Girasol, which is a kind of chevron shape, a rotating house. It's not a complete circle, and as it moves, it follows the sun path, so that certain rooms are always in different kinds of light, and it uncovers or covers up the garden in different modes. And I end the article with a kind of proposition about a spatial and phenomenal agenda, a small analysis of UN Studio Amoeba's house, which follows a new pattern of living. The new pattern in Amoeba's house we might regard as quite privileged to quite wealthy people with good professional jobs, like many of us, well, many of you, I'm a tutor, where there's some work from home, where the pattern of living is related strongly to work, and that's organized around a topographical structure. And that also allows a phenomenal marking of the different spaces as they orientate to the exterior, to day and night, to the seasons. And finally, I guess as part of that pattern of new living, I'm asking for new ways of mapping contemporary ways of living. I myself live in a recombined family with between us 5 children who come and go. Sometimes we need an extra room, sometimes we've got 4 spare rooms, sometimes I'm working from home, sometimes my partner is, sometimes my sons or her daughters are. And I think this is becoming a very kind of common pattern, but as yet it's completely unacknowledged in the way we design homes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Now, just for almost the penultimate part of this magazine event is the final speaker, Vicente Guallart, who runs his own practice with Nuria Diaz in Barcelona. He is a man with many lives. He co-founded the Metapolis Collective, and he is the director now of the Institut d'Arquitectura Avançada de Catalunya in Barcelona, and he is director of an amazing urban project on the periphery of Valencia, creating an entire new community with a number of architects called, I have to plug this one, Sociopolis, and I think the bookshop sold out of the book, but Derek assures me he will have it in again very soon, which is the book all about the project for the city of the future. Now, moving from what Mike was saying quickly to Vicente, he is going to focus on this amazing award-winning project called the Media House, which was presented some years ago and was a 100-strong team, as I explained earlier, in conjunction with MIT Lab. And it is still going, the work is still evolving. So Vicente will tell you more about that.
Okay, thank you. I would like to explain you one part of my work related with the research between the interaction between architecture and new technologies. In fact, I started working as an architect, working in a very, let's say, Spanish way, making bricks one on the top of the other. And in some moment, I decided to start to produce CD-ROMs on architecture. This was in the year '94. That was an economical disaster. We won a lot of awards on design of CD-ROMs, etc., but we didn't sell any CD-ROMs. So finally, I come back to architecture and to research. And in this process of producing CD-ROMs, I will learn from the people from the Media Lab, Negroponte, and all those people were making some very interesting research about the interaction between new technologies and architecture. No? Sometimes I'd say that maybe today the Bauhaus of today is the Media Lab, or was Media Lab, because now it's a little bit down. And because there are many different brains all together trying to generate a new relation between the physical world and the digital world. In some moment, here in Barcelona, we put some people together and we were discussing what we should do to put energy in the system, what we should do, what is important today about architecture. And we realized that this was in the year 2000, where the cell phones start to be everywhere, and the TV channels that come, there were a lot of TV channels. We thought that, I mean, a digital house should be more than this, no? I remember also some advertisement about the washing machine that was very clever, absolutely clever washing machine, was taking care about the hot water in all the house. The washing machine should be the most intelligent thing in the house. And we thought, what a disaster, no? Maybe the house itself should be the most intelligent thing in the... Yeah, the problem is that the somehow we are living in a kind of American approach to the world. The American approach is very much oriented to objects. Objects are very easy, let's say, to put technology there and to sell. And I think in Europe we are more, or in the Mediterranean, we are more oriented to the design of the space, not that it's something much more complex, no? So we were very, young people, we decided why not to go to the Media Lab and to ask them to produce a prototype of a kind of intelligent house, no? When I was a student of architecture, I remember some prototypes of Mies that he built in some shows. And when we study architecture, I didn't distinguish. I was very bad student. I didn't distinguish the real projects and this kind of prototype. So we say we should make a prototype. We should work with those people from the Media Lab. We should work with some people here in Barcelona, and let's try to see which will be the result. We didn't know which should be the result. And what we did, this was the year 2000. This is one of the meetings in the Media Lab when we have only the space. We asked for a theater in Barcelona, big space, and we were discussing with Neil Hessenfield. Neil is a physicist. He was with physics, and he's a new generation in the Media Lab, because the first generation was more about the media and the CD-ROM and the confluence between internet and etc., more digital, but now they are working more in the confluence between physical and digital. No? And they have only this. They create the smallest server in the world. And the concept was that, Marvin Minsky was there in the Media Lab, and he's still there. And they were talking about the artificial intelligence. So the question is, they were thinking to put these microservers everywhere in the, let's say, in the environment, and more than having this kind of architecture, the architecture of the information, no? A computer that somehow control the house. So the computer is outside the house. Sometimes they say if the computer crash, the house crash, no? And this can be, let's say, a problem for your life and for your kids. But if we change the architecture of the information in the house, so the concept could be to put the intelligence everywhere, no? So somehow we could be building a kind of brain. And the house itself could be a brain of the relation of many small intelligence. No, it's like the brain. Marvin Minsky said that what is incredible is that the relation of things that are non-intelligent, like the neurons. Many of non-intelligent things generate something that is intelligent, that is a brain. What is, it's a miracle, no? It's something incredible. So we start to work in this idea, and so they have this technology, this concept that today you can read in many places, the distributed computation. So the question is how architecture could react in front of this new configuration about the structure, because this is changing the structure of the house. We were learning about Gaudí, and we were learning about this more organic approach to architecture. In fact, the modern architecture, Le Corbusier produced these things that it somehow was the house organized by different layers, where the physical structure has no any relation with light or with pipes or what is good, maybe. But what we were thinking was to do something like this, to put all the different layers together, trying to work more like the nature, more like the trees, where the structure and the conducts for all the liquids are the same thing. No? So we were thinking how to make a structure that somehow could be at the same time the physical structure, the power structure, and the data structure, in order to be able to put information. And of course, when I was producing CD-ROMs, we were able to move bits and to move information. Here, for example, if you want to move something from here and put in there, it's nearly impossible, because it's, for example, when you make the design of a bedroom, you know where the bed will be put, because you put the lights exactly where you think it should be, no? So, I mean, we should generate a new possibilities to generate a really open architecture, and in order to do this, the infrastructure should be open. So this is the result. You'll see a structure with different environments, and I will explain you the different layers that we put there. In fact, I think that one of the most important research that we make was this, that is, I mean, if this is a micro server and we are able to put everywhere, we should know what is everywhere or what is everything. So what we did was to try to make a radiography of every interior space, every space, in order to know which different categories of things we have. Because you know that in order to be interactive, you need to be able to catch information from something and to be able to, let's say, to manipulate the information of this. And we discovered that I think that there are 6 categories that are people or beings, no? The second things are objects. For example, the people you are able to measure the temperature of someone. No, this is something that could give information to the system. No, the question is how to take information to the system and how to manipulate it. Okay, people. Objects is another category, very clear. The space itself, that is where today we know more about, for example, with air conditioning. The limits, that this is something, another category of architects normally are working in this limits condition. The networks has a different topology to all the other things and contents. So the question is that we should be able to manipulate all those things. Now, these were the diagrams that we were making that, in fact, at the end, we were able to develop a small part of this. And then we were analyzing all these different layers in order to see, for example, how the people is living today, how one house could be able to read what the people are doing. And you know that Ray Kurzweil say that in the year 2020, one computer PC will have the same capacity of computation like a brain. Maybe to become really intelligent will be a problem of software. But anyway, in some moment, the space and some intelligence will appear. No? So for us, that architects should participate in this and should be able to create the conditions to be able somehow to deal with the space. No, we're thinking if one house is intelligent, what one house will ask to the next house. No, so in fact, like people, the house will talk between each other, and we're thinking about which will be the interface to make relation with the space, like the hands, the human, the voice, etc. No, so we were able to work with something like this. In fact, we were analyzing the different configurations of the space, and we were looking for how to organize the relation between the physical space and the digital space, that are somehow 2 things that are parallels. No? We were taking pictures of all the objects in the house, and we were studying different configurations of this. And I think that the most important thing that we did, in fact, are 2 things. The first is we were working with this idea of making one structure that could be at the same time physical structure, data structure, and power structure, in order to be able to put everywhere in the structure these micro devices. Then we were looking about the different topologies of the data networks. And at the end, what we produced, I mean, I am explaining very fast, what we did was to propose to make a structure like this. Using bars, this was the space, and those bars, as you will see, had inside the data and the power. But when you see what is interesting here is that in the moment that we were generating this, so what is the people from Media Lab was very much interested in the fact that today software is very much related with software and is not related with the reality. And for example, so the transformation of software in something that is physical is a key question, because For example, when you are building, in this case, when you are building the house, you are building the network itself. I will show you. This was the section of all this structure, where you have the physical structure that somehow is the wood, you have here the power, and you have here the data. And in fact, we found this company called Eutrac that had these elements. This is the macro server, and then here we were able to put things that the question was that we should be able to put inside the structure and to remove everywhere. And somehow the information about this element, in fact, was in the object itself. So the question, if you put something that is really hybrid between physical and digital, in this moment, the network of the building, the data network is already built. So somehow this kind of very primitive architecture, like the Indian tent somehow, is like the basic architectural, let's say, construction. And at that moment, it was already a network ready for computation. We were designing all the nodes because in here the nodes we have the physical node, but also the let's say the information. So we should design this like an open node, and this is what we did. We decided to organize another level about the limits. This you will see is plastic, but we decided to make like a kind of thematic environments, because for each of them, that this is another layer, we decided that we should produce also software. I say that the sixth element was the content. Normally software is produced for computers, but what we discovered, I mean, the newest tech is when architecture is dissolved in the space, and it is becoming, the computers are becoming smaller, the image is becoming bigger and it's arriving to the scale of the space. No? In this case was a kitchen. We developed software in order to have in the kitchen, and also important concept is that the media in every space appear in a different configuration. No? In the case of the kitchen was in the table. In the case of the toilet and was related with the beauty is in the mirror. This was another key question. No. Artur Serra, that is our anthropologist, say that if in the 14th century the houses was a kind of society of war, and the houses were related with the defensive situation, today in the knowledge society the houses should be to generate knowledge, no? And the kids are a key element for this. The kids are the professionals for learning. And then we were developing, in fact, software to stimulate the brains for kids. This following some, let's say, methodology, and in fact allowing the kids to draw in the floor and then to record the memory. So we developed another concept is that we develop software for the space. Software will not, I mean, it's for computers, but software should be also and content for the space. About the room, we were working with the chromotherapy, thinking how to be able to manipulate the environment with different colors. And about video conference, we were working with the idea of making video conference not face to face, but space to space. No, like this is like a chroma room, and the people were like sharing somehow spaces. No. Then we develop a website, the website of the house. Every house will have a website in the next future, as the people has their own website, in order to, let's say, not only to control, but also to check and also to be able to make relations about different categories, the house itself, the environment, the different elements, etc. No? We could explain this longer. Okay, so in fact, those were the elements. This is the microserver in the 50s, and this is a microserver today. Okay. So then we had this element in which, let me show you the video, where we make some tests in which we were able to put some different basic, very basic element, because this was, I think, the first time. This is more talking about the different environments. That this is one layer, and the layer related with this kind of brain was dealing with this thing, no? So the question is that we were able to configure everything, but the configuration was done physically, not by software. So you will see how just touching one thing, so you are able to take information from here and to bring to some other place, and then you are able to take one light, one switch, one whatever, and you are able to move if your architecture somehow is open to be able to configure it in an open way. This, no? With a very simple. So the question is that we should be able to configure the house physically and not only by software. Obviously, software also works, but here is somehow is more difficult, and in fact is more physical, is more oriented to the people to be able to remove things, to move things, and to change yourself, your space. No. So somehow this was the result. These different environments. We organize a performance in which we invite 6 artists. We compress 24 hours in 1 hour, and then we invite different artists to inhabit the house. And this is one moment of the performance where there was some video conference, sex action, video conference, and some kitchen and some, in some moment, we were able, because we make, I think, the biggest website in the world, or website projection, 42 meters. We had this parallel between the digital and the virtual. Here we were able to somehow to represent the physical and the digital on the same scale. No? And in fact, after this, the Media Lab generate something. They invent or define the concept of Internet Zero. Today we have the regular internet, but the low-speed internet that send very few information, but a lot of them they call Internet Zero, and today they create a new research group there. We have also the Internet 2, that it is the high-speed internet that was also included in the house. And with this project we are developing in Valencia, in fact, we are going to bring some of this research to the reality, and we are, to the, let's say, commercial or to the real social houses. And also we are dealing with the idea of making also interaction for the whole neighborhood. But this is another history. Thank you.
Okay, I'm acutely aware that we're pushing rather heavily now on the boundaries of our time, so thank you very much, Vicente. It was fascinating, and I want to live in a media house sometime soon. What we will do to just wrap up is to sit behind the desk and take any questions from anybody who would like to raise them. So if we all... we could all stand up instead if it's more a bit more informal. Let's do that.
Question about when you take out those little computers
sit
and
down.
move them around, what sort of changes do they create in the space by taking one piece and moving it somewhere else?
So what is interesting of this device or this concept is that the information is in the object itself, and the logic of this is in the object itself. Normally, when you are thinking about this proof or whatever you are thinking about, this is related with the space, and so this information is here. And when in some magic moment, I remember, for example, that we make some tests where you have 3 lights, and then you put one light in the system, and then the website change and recognize that there is a new light. What is really for me was like magic, no? To see that we are building the digital after the physical, no? So this is the concept, that the information is in the object, and then when you, let's say, you move the physical object, you are moving the information with this. So before somehow, I think we put a lot of energy in order to build the digital wall, and the physical somehow was becoming boring. And what is important now is to put all two together, and then to look for new examples. I think that we saw some very interesting examples that maybe today are in the scale of the art. What is good, I mean, it's like, let's say, maybe can be like a regular building with some interesting software, some logic, no? I think, I mean, we are very much interested in making something that is very structural in order to change somehow the rules about how architecture is working, or what architects are doing, no? Normally the architects, we used to make instruments, but now we should make also music for the instrument. Software and hardware should be together.
Any other questions? Or have we exceeded our... Yep. Matthew.
Maybe it's more like a comment, but thank you. But I found it really interesting, the space between Bouman's project and your project, in the sense that it sets up perhaps a cultural framing of what interactive architecture has been, which in some sense before maybe this book, or before maybe 5 years ago, has been much more naked and much more isolated from a sense of reputation. I was just wondering if you can recognize each other's ambitions, and whether I'm right in thinking that they might be merging.
Well, I've been following his work for quite a while already, and I have the feeling that we had discussions about it. There is some mutual interest, which has to do with a basic curiosity about the future of, let's name it the future of architectural parallax experience, the intensity of architectural and spatial experiences. There is a long tradition of intensifying experience throughout architecture. Reductively speaking, you can call that the history of the parallax, dynamizing experiences through manipulating relationship between objects, people, and meaning, so to speak. And now with the advent of new digital media, and especially since the jump to not just to computers, but to ubiquitous computing, you see that this process of dynamization is going really beyond our classical definition of architecture as an object or a space, right? So this is a kind of dynamic process that we only are at the beginning of. I think he is extremely involved in that process, and I really admire it. And what I was trying to say that is, we also have to address, besides in examining what is possible with these new technologies, to see why we would do it. And the why question is a very basic question. So for the sake of argument, sometimes it's necessary to get away from the technology, although of course in that historical dynamics it's extremely important, do away with the technology and go back to the very essence and the very question, why would you do it if you think about the effects of these technologies and social developments on people? I think that's the missing point in his position. But maybe it's just a matter of short argument. You know, there is much more to tell, and he can do that. But I think the missing point in the argument is that you have to think about the dynamics of these developments, also to the very constituency of the human being, of the body. Who are we? You know, personalities. You cannot just say we are improving the house. We will by use of LED and projection devices, we create an incredible dynamic space, without answering the question, why would we do that? Who are we to appreciate that? And are we still appreciating that, right? So that's another dynamics, the dynamics of personalities, the human condition, so to speak. And these two come together. And I think throughout all the presentations, the dialectics between the two is very visible.
Only I would like to count the number of pages of the people that we make, because we were really looking about what we were talking about. I mean, this is only about.
I knew you could extend it.
No, I think that the connection that also with some other presentation is very much related with the social fact. No? I like very much his approach because I absolutely agree with the fact that somehow technology is not important. Important is what we do with this. And sometimes when we were playing with this, we discovered that it was not useful at all. And then we were looking for some other means. For example, I didn't discover why technology will be good in a house. I know what will be interesting for a neighborhood. I am more interested about the technology in order to generate, let's say, social interaction, for example. In a house today, this is still something very stupid about moving, calling by telephone to your washing machine and things like this that some friends of me are doing, no? So I agree absolutely that this only will happen when the people is using it. And we saw many, for example, Napster, and all these phenomena related with sharing music. This is great. So the people invent how to use technology, and this is absolutely what we are interested.
Any more questions or observations? Mark Dytham is the architect of the week, responsible for the bathhouse. Do you want to make a comment on what you've seen? Because Klein Dytham's IC interactive work is featured in Tokyo within the Bloomberg headquarters. So you can see this project in the magazine.
Only that I live in Tokyo, and I've been communicating with our office back in Japan all week by all sorts of various things. The recent latest thing is Skype, and we're having conference calls basically for free between here. We've got a project in Chicago and Tokyo, and we're all talking in real time for free in my hotel around the corner on a piece of Wi-Fi, which I'm not paying for. I'm getting from somebody else. It's a Belkin 54 modem. If somebody's left the security off of it, but it is amazing how ubiquitous computing's getting. My telephone, that is personal computing. You're walking around with a computer. In Japan at the moment, you've got GPS on this. If you've got a kid, you've got a phone in your pocket, and your parents can see exactly where you are on the internet. It rings up, and you see a cell. And I see this. Everything all converging right now. Even in at home, we've got Wi-Fi, we've got the Apple AirPort at home, in the office, and in our bar, and you just take your computer around. And just this week, it made it very, very clear to me how simple it's all becoming. It all seems, in the presentations today, it all seemed quite disjointed or disconnected, but it is actually all just coming together. And in the last week, that's what I've noticed.
Well, that was the aim of the issue, to somehow kind of let it all come together, at least in a magazine format. So, any other questions? Otherwise, I think that we will adjourn to the bar and speak now or forever hold your peace. I can just then quickly make the plug for the issue, which is available in the Triangle Bookshop for the amazing price of £19.95. And I should also say quickly that AD is celebrating its 75th anniversary, and it is doing that by going online. So the issue is now available for reading and looking at online. All you have to do is to visit www.interscience.wiley.com. It's on all the details on the seats, and register, and then you can read it online. But I do recommend to buy the physical copy. Keep your eyes from getting too tired. So it just remains to thank all the speakers very warmly for their contributions, and equally warmly to the audience for staying the course of our very condensed presentations. I hope in this intense magazine event format that we've managed to crystallise or let's say crystallise some of the issues and motivate you to the audience to look into this area in greater depth, because I do honestly believe that interactive architecture is, let's say, emerging, and therefore it will continue to emerge. So thank you very much, everybody.